These are the oldest stories, online at oldeststories.net. Today we look at a nation formed under a remarkable crucible of external pressure, the kingdom of Urartu. From a chaotic assemblage of diverse and often undeveloped tribal groups, within 20 years, in the middle of the 9th century BCE, a hostile backwater transformed itself into a developed and civilized state with advanced aqueducts and terraces, state-of-the-art fortress cities, and widespread advanced metallurgy. If anyone deserves to be considered for an ancient aliens or a time traveler visit, it's these guys. But as we'll see, the Urartian miracle finds its ultimate explanations in the harshness of the climate and the extreme pressures of the invasions of the 9th century BC, to which must be added a genuine genius on the part of the state builders during the time of Sarduri I, but we'll get to that next episode. Urartu is fascinating more than anything because it's an underappreciated example of national formation and survival, a model that few modern political theorists actually consider when looking to history. And I'm going to tell you, I've been excited to get to these guys for a while, and I hope you're excited with me. To take things back to the beginning then, let's head north of Assyria, in the Armenian Highlands. There had been people up here for as long as we have records. We see them in the archaeology, and we've heard about them from the literate empires on their borders. Hurrian people, the dominant group of this era, go back at least as far as written history, and they often seem to be relatively hard to classify, never building the sorts of concentrations and states that would make them into an empire, but never quite so disorganized either as to be classed as fully barbarian. Today is the story of one Hurrian kingdom, the kingdom of Urartu, which arose in the triangle between Lakes Van, Sivan, and Urmia from about 850s until the late 600s BCE. Now, most people spend nearly every waking moment of their lives not thinking about the Urartian kingdom. And the truth is that I class myself among those people, except of course for this period when I've been intensively researching for these episodes. It's a neat little journey we're about to embark on, and they did play their role in world history, but it is, for the most part, not intrinsically more significant than the parallel story of the Phrygian kingdom we looked at last time, though we do know a bit more about Urartu by virtue of having more sources, and there are some real cool little details that we're going to go through. Some people do, however, seem to spend every waking hour of their life focused on the kingdom of Urartu. Some people, in fact, feel so strongly about some of the disputed facts, mostly around the fall of Urartu, that they believe it justifies, in modern times, various genocides. Others feel strongly that their interpretation of Urartian history absolutely precludes such genocides from being justified. Meanwhile, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that no matter what the facts about the kingdom of Urartu turn out to be, no matter whose side is right in these historical debates, it is still unjustified for the Turks to be genociding the Armenians and Kurds and Assyrians and Alawites today. Also, the forces of Mesopotamian Islam more broadly shouldn't be genociding the Alevis, Chaldeans, Mandeans, Anatolian Greeks, Zazas, Yazidis, Copts, Druze, Baha'is, Shabaks, or Zoroastrians, regardless of who happened to be where in the year 600 BCE. This is not going to be a political episode. If I do that, it'll come out sort of as a bonus episode. But even though I'm not mentioning these debates, you need to be aware that Urartu, perhaps uniquely among the civilizations of the Neo-Assyrian period, is something that some people are highly passionate about. Some are just great fans of the period, and some of them are seeking sort of their ancestral roots. but also among people who see it as a card to play, either for or against the slaughter, displacement, and enslavement of hundreds of thousands of modern innocent people. Now, with all that out of the way, our story begins with the Assyrians. From the late Bronze Age onward, the Middle and Neo-Assyrians interacted with a people called the Nairi, generally representing the people of the northern mountains relatively close to the edge of the Mesopotamian plain. Further north, closer to Lake Van, the Assyrians sometimes speak of Urartu or Urartu, but it's far from clear whether this was a tribe or a geography that they're giving this name to. We have no written records from anyone who ever called themselves Urartian, but we'll get to that in a bit. We have very little sense of what went on politically in the Nairi lands, largely because of this. There were definitely lots of independent tribes and settlements. The unanswered question with the Nairi is who all these tribes were and how interconnected they were. Ethnically, many were definitely Hurrian, but the Armenian Highlands had been a thoroughfare for multiple waves of migrations even before the Bronze Age collapse had just flipped the table on everything, and so we should expect this area to be at least as tribally diverse as Anatolia during the late Bronze Age. But then, as to the question of their interconnection, there's a good argument to be made that there was minimal connection between any of the tribes and settlements in the region. To one extent, archaeologically, we could see pretty clearly that there was a pretty diverse material culture across the highlands, pointing to multiple cultures with markedly different lifestyles. Everyone likely kept to their own valley for the most part, and mobile peoples were unable to grow into overly large agglomerations because the terrain is just so hostile. And I really need to stress how hostile the land itself is. Now, it's sort of a triangle between the three great lakes of the region, but each of these lakes has serious problems. Lake Urmia down in Iran is a salt lake. Water flows in, but it only evaporates out, making it saltier and saltier over time. Lake Van is both saline and volcanic, making its water even less potable, though both do have fish populations that make them worth living near. Lake Sivan, at the north end of the triangle, is freshwater, but it's significantly higher and in much rougher terrain, so it's much less farmable, generally speaking. Rainfall is poor and inconsistent over most of the area, so what agriculture there is relies on the rivers, themselves fed by snowmelt, and many only seasonally flowing. The region of Greater Armenia is, today, decently livable from an agricultural and resources point of view, but a lot of that is dependent on land improvements and agricultural techniques that were developed in ancient and medieval times, none of which seem to have existed prior to the Urartian state. High and dry define this region. It's rocky in a way that inhibits both travel and land working. But of course, humans survive everywhere. The Nairi tribes, and whoever lived to the north of them, each found their own niche in the landscape. The vast majority of peoples were pastoralists, raising animals in the highlands and either facilitating or raiding the trade that passed through the mountain passes. This would have included a good chunk of the tin trade coming in from Afghanistan, as well as a diverse array of luxury goods coming from as far away as Greece in payment for said tin, leading to occasional very exotic finds in the region dating back at least to the late Bronze Age. Meanwhile, there's an early tradition of mountain fortresses among the settled folk, with even quite small farming communities finding the time to cut cyclopean stones for curtain walls that enclose citadels upon high slopes. These fortresses are architecturally less complex and technologically less advanced than those that Urartu is going to build, but still, the idea of a settled community defending themselves and exerting control over an area via stone fortresses is a very old idea in this mountainous region. And remember that as hard as this region is, It's one of the oldest civilized regions on the planet. While we can't say which culture specifically built Göbekli Tepe and their related sites, it's likely that at least one of the many groups in these mountains is the direct descendants of those ancient monument builders. Now, there's always been war in these mountains, but around the time of the Middle Assyrian Empire, we see the first documented invasions of the Armenian Highlands. The campaign journals of the Middle Assyrian kings reveal a region filled with complexity, where each valley seems to have its own king, and the kings do sometimes appear to band together in the face of an external threat. But it's far from clear just what sort of connections they had when not being overwhelmed by an external foe. However, for all this, it seems likely that there were peacetime arrangements of some sort. These have been compared by some to the modern Ashiret, the complex tribal groupings of the Kurds and others in the region that have been known since the Middle Ages at least. And while it's hard to say for sure what structures were in place in ancient times, there are good arguments put forward that some analogous structure was in place to help manage the international trade flows through the region, and assist in international trade that fostered specialized craftsman classes even among the semi-nomadic peoples, and it may have funded the holy sites that seem to have been widely acknowledged among the many different peoples of the region, and it may have organized labor for mining efforts. Now, this general system seems to have been in place during the times of the Mitanni Empire in the late Bronze Age, and likely earlier as well. It isn't clear how much of the Armenian highland was under Mitanni domination, with estimates ranging from none of it to basically all of it. After the Mitanni fell, we have records of the Middle Assyrians entering into Nairi lands for victory and plunder, but no serious conquest of the mountainous region was ever attempted beyond just a demand for submission and tribute from time to time. At least some Assyrian peoples moved into the highlands during this period, but how many and where is unknowable. The Bronze Age collapse hit the region pretty hard, particularly the migration of Kaskans and Mushki from Anatolia, warlike peoples who settled and raided, as well as probably some number of Caucasus and Iranian peoples, shuffling the ethnic mix even further. With the Iron Age and the rise of Assyria, the various mountain peoples get hit more often by organized military activity from the south, but the real change happens right around 850 BCE. Now, King Aram is sometimes called the first Urartian. Very importantly, he is not what we typically call Urartian, even though he gets that ethnic designation in Assyrian writing. In the early 9th century, Ashurnasirpal and the other Assyrian kings had begun to weaken the military coalition of the kings in the southern highlands, the Nairi lands, and other nearby groups like the Habhu, Shubru, Kumu, and other names that we've heard a lot about in previous episodes without ever really understanding who all these people are. And I'm not going to fill that gap in today because we still don't really know who a lot of these people were, even from a northern perspective. But we know that they are certainly weakening and increasingly submitting to Assyrian tribute demands. As the Nairi weaken, a warlord from the southern shores of Lake Van, the geographical region that the Assyrians identify with Urartu, begins to grow his influence. Now, no writings survive from this fellow, King Aram. We don't even know what his ethnicity was. We don't know if Aram was even his name, as the Assyrians don't always get foreign names right. And even though it should be distinguished that he almost certainly wasn't an Urartian king by the Urartians' own standards, he does certainly represent something interesting happening in the Lake Van region. Though an area so chronically full of conflict must surely have had significant warlords at some earlier point in the past, he's the first state builder in Armenian history. We don't see his kingdom in the historical record, but the Assyrians see what he creates as a kingdom to rival their own, at least in a general sense, even if he never got close to the direct level of power that the Assyrians are wielding around that time. We have no idea how he built this kingdom. Prior to the 9th century, however, there is very little visible influence of Mesopotamian culture in the Armenian Highlands. After the 9th century, we'll see the actual kings of Urartu adopting a number of Assyrian and more generally Mesopotamian approaches to empire building, and so it is possible that Arame is the first to try and organize the valleys that he conquered in a way similar to the kings of the lowlands, with the various settled peoples not only offering submission and tribute, but also becoming incorporated into a larger national entity, at least to a certain extent. And it is possible that Arame's kingdom stretched from the southern shore of Lake Van most of the way east to Lake Ermaya, forming a state that would potentially control a good amount of Assyrian access to northern trade routes and northern mineral wealth. Now, having a state this large in such a broken up region would have been impressive by ancient standards. But of course, being strategically located in a way that might be potentially disruptive to Assyrian interests without being openly submissive to Assyria is probably a bad plan. And though we know very little about this era, we do think that a good number of the people groups in the Armenian Highlands seem to have defined themselves, at least in part, by not being like the Mesopotamian lowlanders. Consider this. Though they clearly had at least some level of social complexity, they actively resisted the introduction of writing. Now, this isn't like the Anatolian societies, who seem to have adopted versions of cuneiform, hieroglyphic, and Phoenician writing at various times, but tended to do a lot of their writing on perishable materials like wood and leather, and thus we've lost a lot of their documentation. No. It seems that the Armenian peoples were deliberately illiterate for much of the Bronze Age. I mean, they were illiterate for the entire Bronze Age, but it seems to have been deliberate, at least in the later Bronze Age periods. And this shouldn't be seen necessarily as them being ignorant. We have multiple accountings from ancient sources that speak against literacy from the perspective of oral cultures. Ironically, we only have a relative handful of such accounts that have been recorded because the people putting forward an anti-writing perspective, let's just say they might not have always been writing it down. But from what we do know about societies that are not just illiterate, but anti-literate, rejecting writing even after becoming familiar with it, it's that there seem to be three general complaints. Now, first is that it's seen by some to be creepy for words to exist without a speaker. You can call it black magic or necromancy, or you can insist that there's just something wrong with a clay tablet holding someone's thoughts prisoner for all eternity. Or in a low literacy culture, what would often happen is that someone would write a letter that would be written by one scribe and then read by another scribe in some distant town who had never met the original speaker. And this could well be seen as improper for another person to take on the original person's words. And indeed, all of these dynamics do sometimes lead to odd and magical ideas in the literate Mesopotamian societies. It's just that the Mesopotamians seem to have been fine with it, while other societies saw these things as perverse or what have you. Now, the second complaint is that writing makes people stupid and devalues their memory. This is something you get more in rather advanced societies like Greece and Egypt and China and such, places where literacy is low enough that most people are illiterate, but there is still an educated class that has had experience with the illiterate people and the literate people, and they're just sort of comparing both modes of life. Now, the Anatolian Highlands may not have been quite connected with the literate Mesopotamian culture well enough to have come to a conclusion like that, but on the other hand, these were a highly mobile set of people, conducting themselves actively in international trade, so maybe they did have enough connections to have come to a conclusion like this. There are certainly at least some cognitive benefits to illiteracy in some circumstances, and having just promoted the virtues of illiteracy, I'll note that if you ever get tired of listening to the Oldest Stories podcast, remember that I do have a book available for sale on Amazon, History and Myth from Sumer and Akkad, so do consider that if you've forgotten it. Anyway, a third possibility is that they were actively rejecting Mesopotamian culture, seeing it as foreign and other. This wouldn't have been simple xenophobia either. A good number of Mesopotamian cultural practices that were well suited to the climate and society of the southern peoples would have been rather ill-suited to the mountains, and it's entirely possible that the smaller scale societies of Armenia may have seen especially the very costly, difficult writing system of the south as being just deeply unsuited to their culture, possibly even quite wasteful. Now, this illiteracy thing is interesting because over in the eastern Iranian mountains, the general assumption is that most of the peoples were too low density, too underdeveloped, and too generally poor to have adopted writing, whereas the Mesopotamian neighbors who were decently civilized all seem to have adopted writing pretty much as soon as they were settled in enough to start making those kind of exchanges. Remember that cuneiform writing is literally the ultimate origin of every single writing system in Africa and Eurasia, aside from those based on the Chinese model. So the whole writing thing really did get around quite quickly. In the Armenian Highlands, however, they seem to have just rejected the idea of writing despite being decently well developed and intimately connected to the wider literate world for literally thousands of years. We know that the Sumerians in the early Bronze Age were communicating regularly enough with the Armenian Highlands to know about their products, their gods, and their holy cities. Now, I don't want to belabor their illiteracy too much here because we're only about 2 decades from the enthusiastic adoption of writing in Urartu, but I do want to emphasize that at least part of the Armenian identity for a good chunk of ancient times is them not being like the lowland Mesopotamians. And this is interesting in and of itself, and can be at least one lens through which we see their period of conquests and construction. Anyway, King Aram, of the nation whose name we don't know, built a kingdom sometime in the mid-9th century. As far as we can tell, he was a dynastic founder and managed to collect the most significant towns and mining areas under his rule over an unclear amount of time. And in the process, as we said before we got distracted, it turns out that his kingdom was strategically in the way of the Assyrian Empire, and thus, for the crime of existing in the wrong place, and possibly also a latent hostility to the lowland empire, Shalmaneser made it his goal to absolutely annihilate the burgeoning kingdom. In 858, Shalmaneser's second year on the throne, he marched the Assyrian army up to Aram's capital of Segunia and burnt it down. Aram then moved his capital after this defeat to the more northerly town of Urashkun and was able to not only hold but expand his control over the region. So, 5 years later, Shalmaneser went back up north and annihilated Urashkun as well as a number of other southern towns in Aram's kingdom, putting paid to his ambitions, though Aram himself is believed to have survived and continued to be a local leader for some time after this. Now, we talk a lot here about Assyrian campaigns sometimes not being as destructive as they're made out to be, since the language used can speak to absolutely annihilating enemies that remain stubbornly unannihilated even after many such extermination campaigns. And it's valuable to recognize that even though the Assyrian army was constantly at war. They weren't always decimating the countryside with their passage. The conquered or defeated lands are, in many cases, visibly prosperous again after only a few years. But sometimes the Assyrian devastation really was as bad as they make it out to be. Sometimes the earth really is scorched, and in Shalmaneser's campaigns of the 850s, I think we're seeing that. It makes strategic sense here. The Assyrian Empire doesn't, at this point, have the systems or experience needed to hold these mountainous areas as provinces, nor can they reliably keep the distant mountain lords as submissive vassals over the long term. However, Shalmaneser and his father Ashurnasirpal had clearly seen the strength of Aram's kingdom, and since it couldn't be incorporated into the empire, the best solution was simply to burn it to the ground in dramatic and genocidal fashion. The destruction of Urartu and many other destructions around that time were not systematic. There were far too many valleys and crevasses for the Assyrian army to have rounded everyone up with the efficiency we see, for example, in the annihilation of northern Israel a century later. But it was a crucible, forcing huge numbers of people to move out from the southern mountains and into the often less hospitable northern highlands. And just imagine it. You're living in a valley around Lake Van. You're already maxing out the agricultural potential of your little slice of Armenian heaven, when suddenly a bunch of migrants show up, inflating your population by perhaps 50% at the low end, perhaps 200% at the high end. These people don't necessarily speak your language, nor are they necessarily familiar with the traditions of this area. But they certainly can fight. When things like this occurred during the Bronze Age collapse and in other historical migration eras, this can cause groups to continue migrating past these valleys. But there must have been pretty hard barriers to the people of the Armenian Highlands keeping them from moving out. From the east, you've got various groups at about the same time, including Medes and Parsua, seeming to have been moving in, creating pressure, keeping folks from going east, possibly even bringing people in from the east at the same time. In the west, you have something similar. The post-Hittite central and northern Anatolia seems to have been an absolute thunderdome between the energized Kaskin remnants and the poorly understood kingdoms of that area. To the north, the Scythians and Cimmerians and related groups have become so prosperous and overpopulated that they're now pushing quite hard on the Caucasus Mountain cultures. And quite likely at the same time as this Assyrian push from the south, you've got people coming in from east, west, and north into the Armenian Highlands, just because it's the only place that doesn't have some larger, scarier power already dominating it. The rapid growth in the Armenian population is defining, and it's sudden, and it's absolutely unsustainable. It's a pressure cooker, and historically speaking, 9 times out of 10, when you get a situation like this, these various groups are going to kill each other off, and they're just going to leave nothing but a feral and terrifying raider culture like the Kaskins or Gutians. Just, the most powerful killer survives all the killing. But just as pressure usually causes explosions, every now and then, everything lines up right for the pressure to compress into a diamond. And that diamond, birthing the kingdom of Bia, is a man named Sarduri, son of Lutibri. Sarduri is the first king of the nation that we commonly call Urartu, which he himself would have called Bi'ainili. The name Urartu, which later evolved via Hebrew into Ararat, was the Assyrian name, possibly related to some archaic tribal group that once lived around Lake Van, or possibly just an Assyrian name for that geographical region. Bia, however, was the name of Sarduri's people, initially either a tribe or ethnic group, but as he builds and grows his kingdom, The name comes to encompass all the diverse peoples he rules over and the geographic region. Via linguistics, we can see that Bi-Nili eventually turns into Van, as in the modern name of Lake Van. How exactly that works, I really couldn't tell you. Sometimes the linguists are just like, oh yeah, this turns into this and this turns into that, and it follows all the rules of language changes. And I'm like, man, you gotta be stoned to come up with some of these rules of language changes, but that's neither here nor there. I do trust the linguists, even if I mock them viciously. In the language that we call Urartian, which is itself just a dialect of Hurrian, the suffix "ini" is something like land of or people of. So Bi-Nili is the land of the Bia people. And it's this which Sarduri establishes here amidst this crucible on the eastern shore of Lake Van sometime in the 840s. To clarify a bit further, in many Urartian kings lists, you're going to see the list begin with Aram, and then he's followed by Sarduri. But the fact is that while we get this impression from the Assyrian records, which call every state in the Lake Van region Urartu, we have no indication that Aram ruled over the Bia people. And it is the Bi-Nili who make up what we more typically call Urartu. And in any case, it is Sarduri who is the source of the unique genius of the Urartian kingdom, not Aram, and we know this from archaeology. He is going to transform this eclectic and disorganized rabble into a nation of engineers, pushing the cultural and physical materials available to him to a peak that even the Assyrians will prove unable to match. Sarduri is the reason that people look funny at Urartu and start speculating about aliens and whatnot. I mean, really, seemingly from out of nowhere, he constructs something akin to an Armenian Wakanda in the space of a generation. Fortresses that astonish even modern archaeologists, aqueducts that run for tens of miles across wretched, broken terrain, and most of all, a social system that holds nomadic peoples within the same state as settled folk across multiple ethnicities. And to this last, think of another settled society that managed to include multiple ethnicities of nomadic peoples in its governing system. I can think of some examples where nomadic peoples ruled over settled societies, or where a settled society partnered with a single nomadic people, but what Sarduri managed amidst the peaks of the Armenian mountains is rare enough to be genuinely exceptional among all of history. But now that I've gotten us all excited about Sarduri and the explosive rise of Urartu, that's where we're going to leave it for today. It doesn't make sense to start one of the most remarkable historical shifts without having the time to fully explore it in the episode. So if you have friends who you think might be interested in a topic like this, please consider sharing it, like on social media or something, because this is going to be a series that very few people are searching for actively, but a lot of people probably wish they knew more about. And after you've done that for me, make sure you join us next time for some remarkable engineering and a radical cultural transformation, and of course, a good amount of old-fashioned conquering. Thank you for listening.